Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. I'm your host, Carolyn Hayes, film critic and journalist, and this is the podcast / YouTube channel where I speak to film creatives and those in the industry about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I'm joined by Goran Topalovic to talk about the celebration of Korean film, and it's an event being held by the Lincoln Film Center, which coincidentally also hosts the New York Asian Film Festival that I just recently covered. So, and it was also co-founded by Goran. So I'm very excited to have him here to join me to talk about the project, which is going on from September the 1st to September the 17th this year to celebrate an amazing decade of Korean film, and that will be the decade of the 1960s. So it's going to be fun to talk about these films. So first of all, thank you, Goran. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Carolyn. Thank you for having me.
So I always like to ask my guests, first of all, what got them interested in their work. So for you, what got you interested in covering East Asian cinema, but more specifically South Korean cinema? Because as I mentioned at the beginning, you co-founded the New York Asian Film Festival as well as the Subway Cinema organization. So what got you interested in film and starting as a film critic and then starting all of these organizations to celebrate the making of film?
So it's all started back in 1980s when I was a teenager growing up in Yugoslavia, and I've always been a big movie buff. And it is at that time that I developed interest and love for Hong Kong movies, right? Of course, it all started with Bruce Lee and then Jackie Chan and action films. And after I moved to the States, then I had access to New York Chinatown theaters and Chinese video shops and laserdisc stores, right? So it all kind of grew from there, and I became involved in the local Asian cinema subculture. So it was all kind of grassroots, and we also started exchanging information on something called internet, which we're all trying to figure out how to use, and to build our own web pages with HTML code. So
the good old days.
Yes, good old days. So it really all started from there, and ultimately, those of us who were frequenting Chinatown movie theaters would ultimately become co-founders of the New York Asian Film Festival, but that's probably a story for another day. And as far as the Korean cinema, for me, the interest in Korean cinema started in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, and it really started with a couple of films. It was director Lee Myung-se's Nowhere to Hide from 1999 that just kind of blew my mind, and I've never really seen anything like it. And I think it's still a film that's a bit underwatched and undervalued, I would say. So I would recommend your audience to seek out that film. It's called Nowhere to Hide. There should be a DVD release at one point. There was a DVD release at one point, but it's also a movie that needs to be, released on Blu-ray. So hopefully someone will pick it up one of these days. And yeah, so just I've always been like that. Whatever I'm curious about and wanted to learn about other country cinemas, and I would always kind of do research by myself. And back in those days, once again, information wasn't that accessible on the internet, right? So now it's just so easy to find out information, but back in the day, we relied on the network of like-minded fans and exchanging movies, and also started traveling to Asia to attending film festivals, and kind of that's how it all went, I guess.
Yeah, we have a lot in common, not just our interest in East Asian cinema and Korean cinema in particular, but also kind of like how we got involved in watching Asian cinema in general. Like for me, it was the same Hong Kong films, like things like Shaolin Temple, Drunken Master, the old Silver Fox movies. Like I grew up
the Shaw Brothers,
the Shaw Brothers, yes, they're the innovators of action films, Asian action films, Bruce Lee, of course, but also I think discovering the internet. I think where we live now, and it ties into what we're discussing, is the internet has made it was so confusing and so I think it's still very confusing. I'm going to be 40 at the end of this month. My birthday is August 31st. So I'm from the generation of discovering the
Yes.
dealing with
Yes.
dial-up, having to use CD-ROMs to download programs and all of
Mm-hmm.
that. So,
Mm-hmm.
and having, like, for me, discovering film came part with pirating. I also support pirating because without pirating, I would have never been able to watch as many films as I do. But I was able to watch these films by going to my local video store and renting VHS tapes, and like watching things like Turner Classic Movies and TNT.
Mm-hmm.
And I fell in love with Asian cinema for the very same reason, because I think coming from the Caribbean, like a lot of our culture is very similar in the fact, like some things culturally, like the way we prepare food, taking off our shoes indoors. I've always found like an affinity for Asian cinema,
Mm-hmm.
especially for Korean cinema, because I think our cultures, like I'm from Barbados, our cultures are ironically kind of similar. Like, respecting our elders, how we address people is very specific. And that's one of the things that draws me to Korean cinema and draws me to events like this celebration of golden decade of cinema for Korean film, because I think for a lot of people, Korean cinema flew under the radar for so many years. And now, of course, everyone thinks of Parasite when they talk about like now the whole this new wave of interest in Korean cinema. Of course, we knew the Hallyu wave was in the mid 2000s, and then there was another second. I think we're technically in the third wave of the Hallyu wave,
Oh, there's
but
so
like
many waves now,
there's so
right?
many
So,
waves, right?
and
But
and there's so many aspects of it, right? So yeah.
yeah, there are. And when you watch films, and I'll admit I haven't watched as many of the older Korean films like these ones from the 60s. So I'm very happy to be able to talk to you about these, because like most of the Korean films that I watched were like from the 90s and
Mm-hmm.
onward. Most of them were
Yeah.
action films. I'm a
Yes.
very big fan of the action films. Like Mad from Nowhere is one of my top action films ever.
Yes.
And I think the one you mentioned, I think that's an action film, isn't it? I think
Nowhere to
it's
Hide. It's an action film, but it's more than just that, right? It
well,
just, yeah.
for me, most Korean films are very, very layered. Like for these ones, the ones I selected to talk to you today about, one is The Devil's Staircase from 1964, A Woman Judge
Mm-hmm.
from 1962, and
Mm.
Aimless Bullet from 1960, because I wanted to get like a broad range across the decade. And
Yeah.
first, for this celebration of South Korean cinema, I wanted to ask you, why specifically the 60s? Why did you choose this specific decade to highlight and to celebrate?
Right. So as you mentioned, right? So most people are familiar with new Korean cinema, which is that movement that just kind of exploded on the international scene, right? Late 90s into early 2000s, and Bong Joon-ho. They really culminated with Bong Joon-ho getting the Oscar for Parasite, right?
Yeah.
So there was a question like, when was the last time in Korean film history that they had such explosion of not just creativity but also growth of the domestic film industry? And that turned out to be the 1960s. So the first golden era of Korean cinema. And scholars are debating when exactly does it start, when does it end, and they say, okay, maybe it really started in late 50s and goes all the way into kind of early 70s. But in order kind of to make this a little bit more manageable from the curatorial standpoint, we said, okay, we're just going to do the 60s because this is really where the kind of the pinnacle of that, and as we call it, a golden decade, right? So those were really the truly the boom years in Korean cinema, where after the war ended in 1953, and in the 60s, you already have this amazing volume of productions and range of productions. Why it happened? It's a combination of several factors. It's really a combination of certain government policies and state control, and even being protectionistic of the domestic industry, and creation of a production system as a response to these policies, as well as a lot of creative energy after the war, to rebuild the country, and a lot of passionate filmmakers who wanted to tell their stories. So you have all those elements coming together, and of course the audience who really liked watching the films. So, and there was kind of main entertainment. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to highlight the 1960s as a kind of very important era in Korean cinema history, and one that has resulted in films that people can still enjoy today and can draw inspiration from. today. So.
I agree, because recently I watched I've seen like older films, because I think one of the oldest ones, I think probably the oldest Korean film I've seen is one called Mandala, and I think it's an extremely long film, but I think it was something that's been very interesting for me with Korean films, because I started getting into Korean cinema, like as I said, like from the 2000s, like when I lived back home in Barbados. But one thing I've always found very interesting in Korea, because of their history with the war, but also Japan, the occupation of Japan, and all of that, is like their films to me have always been very political. Same thing with their dramas. Even when you watch a film that seems totally innocuous on the surface, like, especially for their action films, there's always an underlying theme of politics and class systems, because it's something that's so, I think, specific to their culture in particular. Like they went immediately from the occupation of Japan, from Japan occupying them and colonizing them, straight into the war. I don't even call it the Korean War, because it wasn't started by them, but I call it the war in Korea. And like everything that transpired with that. Then you had their dictatorships, then you had the movement for democracy, then you had the whole industrial boom with the 1988 Olympics, and all of these things play a part in all of their stories. And even in the films that you selected for the 1960s, they all talk about some way in politics, like a woman judge talks about, this is a woman she's has a career as a judge, but she's still being told to choose family, still being told to choose her husband, and all of these stories, and then all of these subplots, and how all of these subplots all tie into how women are being, no matter they're being told to be successful, but still being expected to, live in a patriarchal society. And then Aimless Bullet, that talks about the devastating effects of the war on like the soldiers, how that further impacts their families. And like the whole Aimless Bullet, I thought that film, you think the Aimless Bullet is this one protagonist, and then at the end you realize, wait, no, it's someone else, it's like this other character. And then you realize basically all of these men became aimless bullets after the war. Like all of these, basically, like the war is the gun and they're the bullets, right? So I love how these films tackle these themes. And then for The Devil's Staircase, it's again about class, like this doctor, he's trying to level up his status by marrying this rich woman, and then it's like, who is the person that's going to be victimized because of this, and like that's something I love about Korean cinema. Like they talk so much about, yes, you got the affairs, the love, the romance, the betrayal, the agony, but it's all underscored by how their culture is. So they're still dealing with so much grief, and so much psychological trauma, and so much collective trauma as a country, which I think is so fascinating how all of their stories are in that. So I want you to talk now about your perspective as someone who's watched all of these films and then curating all of these stories, and then starting something in the New York Asian Film Festivals, and why you think it's important to highlight these specific stories and highlight Korean cinema, especially now. Like people think, oh, it's like this new interest, but I'm just like, I'm always of the opinion is like, I try not to like highlight cinema because it's a trend and it's a fad, but like for me, it's a way of getting to know the culture and getting to know the people and getting to know the politics of Korea. Because I think Korean films is, when you watch a Korean film, you can kind of get an understanding of the Korean politics, and it makes me more curious to learn more about why the filmmakers are why talking so much about their politics is such a, I think, an intrinsic part of their storytelling.
Because it's such a part of their life. And like when you done that really great summary of kind of Korean history, from being a colony to the war to rapid industrialization, modernization, and authoritarian governments, and all this has happened in a very, very short time period, right? So you can imagine just the level of traumas that one has to deal with, right? So I think you really nailed it, even in terms of your assessment of these films that you picked to talk about. So I'm not even sure that I can really add anything more to it, to what you already said. So but I think even though all these stories may be specific to their cultural and historical context, I think they're still universal, right? So and I think that's the kind of important thing to showcase. Not even so much, yes, there are political issues and there are class issues, but ultimately in terms of challenges that we all have as humans going through life, and the decisions that we make, and what drives us, and how can we all live better together, right? I think this all speaks to that in a way, right? That's sort of how I look at it.
Right. And so for this particular project, for the 1960s, the interesting thing is I attended an event for TIFF that was held at TIFF recently, where we watched a film called Madame Freedom. Yes. And it's kind of also about highlighting Korean cinema. Like now TIFF, the actual festival is coming up, and like I'm trying to get more, I'm trying to get access to films for the festival. But what is it, not only about South Korean cinema, but Asian cinema in general, that really appeals to you? Because you've made highlighting these films such a big part of your career and such a big part of your path as a critic and a journalist and a lover of film. Like, what is it about Asian films in general that attracts and appeals to you so much?
I don't think there's a really simple answer to that, because I think if I look at the last 20 years, and through different parts of my life, there's certain different aspects that appeal to me at any given time. Because as we grow, as we change as individuals, right, we become interested also in different things as we mature, right? So maybe initially, I think the attraction of Hong Kong action cinema was at a purely kind of visceral level, and really the artistry, the action choreography and the scenes that they could imagine and execute. No one else was making films like that, right? So and it was really its own world. It was an alternative to whatever Hollywood or other countries were making right at the time. There was also always this certain kind of identification of those who are kind of oppressed, but they can develop skills, and then they can win against the more powerful opponents, right? So there was aspect of that, but then I think there's also certain appeal to me, and I think this is also what you mentioned earlier. Kind of, you see some similarities between certain aspects of your culture and Korean culture, and I would say that's kind of true for me as well, in a sense that I grew up in the Balkans and the old Yugoslavia, and there's certain aspects of the kind of the Balkan mentality and history, peninsula, always being kind of between the big powers and not always in control of its own destiny, right? And there's certain national character traits that develop as a result of that. So I'm also able to observe some of those commonalities with certain Korean stories and experiences that are expressed in cinema. So.
Great. We're up for time now, but this was great. This was brief but great. But I'm gonna have to ask you to come back and talk to me for another interview for my podcast, because I have so many things to ask you and to talk about. But thank you so much for speaking with me today, Goran, and thank you so much for highlighting these films, because I actually now have a whole other list of films to watch now, which I'm very happy about.
And thank you so much, Carolyn. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I hope we'll have another chance to talk more on these subjects that are dear to us. So.